Okay, welcome to this session where we're looking at sort of a cross-national perspective on the idea of a green recovery. My name's Mitya Pearson. I'm based at the University of Cambridge and also co-convener of the PSA in Environmental Politics group. This is the third of our 4 virtual sessions that we're running across 2 days on COVID-19 and environmental politics. When we conceived of this overall event a few months ago, obviously there was a lot of discussion about the impact of COVID on the environment, and particularly sort of very active discussion of the idea of a green recovery, particularly states' responses to COVID and how that would affect the environment. So we kind of partly thought ahead in terms of it would be interesting to think a few months ahead and consider where have we actually got to in that. And we also were very keen to take an international perspective and try and survey as much as we can with a few panelists sort of across what's going on across different parts of the world. So one of our speakers today is going to give more of a kind of general international overview, and then we've got three speakers who are going to focus down in their roughly 10 minutes onto specific areas of the world, and hopefully by that we'll get a useful comparison. Each speaker is going to speak for roughly 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a decent amount of time for Q&A and discussion. So either during individual contributions from speakers or after, during the Q&A session, please submit questions via, there's a Q&A button, so if you submit those written questions via that button, they'll come through to me and I'll feed them through, so don't be shy of submitting questions. So I'll introduce each speaker in turn, but we're going to start with Josh Gabbatiss from Carbon Brief.
Hiya. So if anyone's not familiar with Carbon Brief, just a quick overview, we're a journalism platform that focuses on climate and energy. We do a lot of original analysis as well, and sort of long form features looking at big issues and trends in climate change and energy politics. So this year, as the pandemic began, we started to look initially at the impact that it was having on emissions. So we did quite an early piece in February, examining the impact that early lockdown measures in China had on CO2 emissions there. And there was initially a 25% drop in the country's emissions during the early lockdown. But it was pretty clear that the lasting impact for the climate and for emissions wasn't going to come from the lockdowns themselves. Since that analysis was done, China's emissions have crept back up, and clearly that was going to be a kind of broader trend, even if there are long-term impacts on people's behaviour, which has been discussed, of perhaps travelling less in cars or taking fewer flights. It's unlikely that that's going to be of the kind of magnitude we need to reduce emissions sufficiently for the world to achieve its climate targets. So the IEA, for example, estimated that this year the world's CO2 emissions are expected to drop by 8% due to kind of global coronavirus lockdown measures. And that sounds like a lot, and it is quite considerable, but that's roughly in line with the kind of the emissions cuts that we need every year this decade if we're going to limit warming to less than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures as required, not as required, but as set out in the Paris Agreement. So obviously we don't want to have to shut down the global economy every year to achieve our emission targets, and we would have to continue shutting down more and more to carry on cutting emissions efficiently. So basically it became clear to us and to lots of people that a green recovery was the way that these emissions cuts could be kind of locked into the economy. This was a kind of a call that was echoed by a lot of figures, a lot of world leaders, bodies like the IEA, NGOs. I think the Pope has also mentioned green recovery. And basically it's to prevent, I mean, after the global financial crisis in 2008, emissions basically resurged back to previous levels and beyond that, basically as a result of countries panicking, trying to find ways to rebuild their economies. Sorry, I'm told I'm moving around too much. So I'll try and avoid that noise. But essentially, yes, as economies tried to rebuild, reinvigorate their economies, there was a lot of investment in fossil fuel infrastructure. And that kind of led to emissions surging back up beyond previous levels. So basically, the message is that if any positivity is to be gleaned from the current situation, it will need to come in the form of a green recovery, which means investing in clean technologies. And yeah, essentially governments mobilizing funds towards that level of the economy, promoting green jobs, that kind of thing. And this is something which, as I say, has got support from a lot of figures around the world, and also is backed by a study that we also covered at Carbon Brief, was based on some research from Oxford, which suggested that this approach, not only will it be what's required to get us towards a net zero pathway for the world, it will also offer the best economic returns for government spending. So anyway, all of that in mind, we recognised at Carbon Brief that this was going to be the big climate change story this year. The moves by different governments around the world to either invest or not invest in green technology. So we decided quite early on that as a platform, we needed to start trying to keep track of all the different pledges that were being made by governments around the world. So this is easier said than done. If you follow these kind of things in the press, there are a lot of announcements being made, often in kind of dribs and drabs, sometimes big overarching stimulus packages. But yeah, keeping track of all those packages, governments aren't always inclined to kind of lay things out neatly and succinctly. So it's hard to keep track of what is what's a loan, what's just spending, what's tax breaks, and all of these different things are adding up to these overarching stimulus packages. So and one example, for example, one issue that we have encountered while thinking about this is that some governments have kind of there's maybe packages of money that they had already promised in election manifestos, for example, which they've kind of repackaged, rebranded as being part of their green stimulus package. So, does that count as green stimulus or not? Does it count as coronavirus stimulus? These are all questions that we had to basically think about from the start. So we set a few rules. We ignored the initial rescue packages. So things like in the UK, the furlough scheme. These things were announced purely to save jobs and businesses. We focused more on the long-term recovery component of spending. We also decided, and this is something which again has received a lot of press attention, but we also decided to ignore stimulus packages being announced for fossil fuels. So we're focusing just on the money that is being announced for clean technology. And while we're kind of keeping an eye on how governments are spending on sort of dirty technology at the same time, we decided it'd be too big a job to keep an eye on everything. So basically, we've tried to compile this into an interactive tracker, which is on our website, and I'll share with you in a moment. And yeah, so essentially, yes, because at Carbon Brief, we try to not kind of make value judgments. So we're not kind of in the business of saying this investment is good and this investment is bad. So we haven't kind of totted up the fossil fuel versus clean components and sort of said this country is doing better than this country, but we're kind of leaving that up to people to decide from looking at what we've done. Yeah, I mean, something that, for example, has received a lot of attention is the kind of airline bailouts, which have been, I mean, other organisations are keeping track of those. The NGO Transport and Environment, I think, has got a total of it's over 30 billion has been pledged to 30 billion euros has been pledged to bailing out airlines so far, and obviously that matters from a climate perspective. And we are, alongside our tracker, we're kind of we're writing little passages of text to kind of describe the context of what's going on. So we've included that kind of thing in those passages, but not in the tracker itself. Anyway, enough talking about it. I'll share you into what we've been doing. So this is our tracker. So as you can see, we've got a little bit of introduction here, kind of describing what I've been talking about. And here is the tracker. As you can see, we've kind of divided up all the different components of spending by sector, with a little description of what's going on with each one. When the big funding was announced, we've got the links to original government sources here. And we've tried to attach a number to each one. As I sort of alluded to before, this is not always easy. Some of these packages haven't actually got numbers attached to them yet, or are in the form of tax breaks and that kind of thing, in which case it's hard to say how much they consist of. So yeah, most of the nations we've looked at so far are in Europe, but as you can see, we've looked at a few others. We've looked at major economies like China and India, the kind of the bits of money they've announced so far. We've also looked at Nigeria, New Zealand, South Korea, but mostly in Europe so far, and of course the European Union package as well, which is kind of got the initial proposal by the Commission, which is still exactly where the money will go, which different components. So certain areas are definitely emerging as priorities. We've seen quite a lot of spending going towards energy efficiency measures for building. So things like retrofits and low carbon heating. I think this is partly to do with the fact that a lot of governments want to focus on job creation, and this is an area where there's a lot of jobs in housing renovation, essentially. So if you put money into that, you can kind of guarantee lots of jobs. Another area that's received a lot of attention is transport. So in France and Spain, for example, there have been quite substantial packages of funding to save their automotive industries. I think in Spain it's something like 10% of GDP from the automotive sector. And a lot of these measures have sort of green strings attached to them, so people will be incentivized to purchase electric vehicles, or at least lower emission vehicles than the ones they currently have. What else do we have going on? We've got, so somewhere like Nigeria is quite interesting. We have had the UN Secretary General highlight this as a good example of a green response, although maybe not one that you'd necessarily expect. In Nigeria, fuel is heavily subsidized, and so the government in Nigeria has taken this the coronavirus disaster as an opportunity to reform its subsidy framework. So maybe this isn't a direct, this is an example of something that's not necessarily branded as a green stimulus measure, but does have potentially quite significant climate implications. So yeah, this is certainly not comprehensive. We're kind of always open to new things. We're kind of trying to keep an eye on where in the world announces what, but yeah, there's a lot going on, and things are often announced in bits, or not necessarily described as being stimulus measures, but maybe could be described as that. Some governments have kind of helpfully put together packages that they've referred to as green stimulus, and that makes things a lot easier for us, and others not so much. As I said before, we're kind of not trying to, you know, it's difficult to kind of, ultimately we would like to add up all these figures and find out which countries are giving the most to the green recovery, but that's difficult to do at the moment. We're going to have to sort of reassess that later on. As I said, there aren't always numbers attached to these packages, and ideally, I think something that a lot of people want to see is how that compares to the amount they're investing in fossil fuels, which is understandable. We haven't done that, but we have got this chart in our piece from the consultancy Vivid Economics, which is kind of gives you a sense of how things are looking so far. So they've looked at how kind of green measures compare to brown or, you know, dirty stimulus. As you can see, the brown is looking a lot larger at the moment than the green, but also I would note that their results are actually quite different to ours, and that kind of reflects the difficulty in keeping track of these things. There have been lots of announcements made, and some of them are not what we would consider to be a green stimulus, for example, but other people have done. Yeah, I think so. I'll stop sharing this now. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, like I said, we're very open to ideas and feedback on this. As I sort of mentioned earlier, this is kind of the big, you know, 2020 was meant to be a really big year for climate change. It's the start of this sort of crucial decade. We're going to see a round of ambition raising with countries coming forward with new nationally determined contributions ahead of the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow at the end of this year. That's now been cancelled, as has everything else, because of coronavirus. So now this is the big story of this year, and we're kind of trying to keep track of it, because these measures that are being announced now are really going to have enormous implications for the years to come, and for, yeah, whether or not the world achieves its targets in the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot. And people watching who haven't looked at that, definitely a very good resource to be trawling through. So next, Dr. Carl Death from the University of Manchester.
There we go. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mitya, for the invitation. and thanks everyone else for coming along. I've got a few slides, but they're just really images to prevent you from having to mainly look at my face the whole time. So I hope everyone can hear me. I'll try to be as stick to time. I work on South African politics, so I'm going to say a few things about South Africa. I noticed South Africa came right at the bottom of Josh's last ranking of states' response in the green recovery. So I'll say a few things about that. I was going to divide up what I said first in terms of impacts of COVID on African political ecologies, because I think there's some interesting points to be made there, and then say something about some of the both South African and broader continental responses as well. I should also say at the start that I don't work on disease or COVID, so these remarks are based on my, as everyone else's, reading of the press coverage and reports, and talking to a few colleagues as well in South Africa over the last few weeks. I wanted to just say at the start that I think there was an assumption that COVID would be something of an apocalypse in Africa more generally for some fairly obvious reasons. And there's a related assumption which has political ecology dimensions, I think, that zoonotic diseases like COVID, but also HIV/AIDS and Ebola are particularly associated with or prevalent in places of the world like in the African continent. What's quite interesting, and has dominated a lot of the recent coverage of Africa and COVID, is the surprisingly low infection rate and mortality rates compared to initial predictions. That the predictions of a kind of plague sweeping Africa haven't been borne out, and I think there are some interesting political ecology reasons for that as well. And so for this really interesting recent paper by Joseph Apong points out that there's a whole set of reasons for this, including the most obvious perhaps is the relatively younger demographic in Africa, but also a more rural and dispersed elderly population, and also biophysical legacies of past exposure to infectious diseases. Most importantly, perhaps the political and public health experience of dealing with past infectious diseases, particularly the Ebola outbreaks in 2014 and 2018. So related to this, directly related to this, there has been quite a strong political response across the continent, and particularly in South Africa, which has got a lot of press coverage for its quite strict or in some ways effective response to the outbreak. I'll say a few more things about those in a minute, but just as initial kind of setting the scene, you can see these figures from the BBC, and Africa rates of infections and also mortality are relatively low. And now, of course, this is not this. I don't by any means underemphasize the huge adverse effects of the pandemic across Africa as elsewhere. And really the infection figures or the mortality figures don't do justice to that. The UN Economic Commission for Africa has estimated the disease has the potential to push 29 million people into extreme poverty. The African Development Bank estimates 50 million. Now, South Africa is a really interesting case study of some of these features, although of course it's by no means a typical case in Africa. I'll say something briefly towards the end about Nigeria as well, which Josh also mentioned in his talk. So South Africa was widely praised at the start for its response, its strict lockdown and its program of community screening. Despite this, there have been large numbers of cases, 640,000, and deaths, 15,000. Huge job losses and economic contraction, widespread hunger, and lockdown, as in much of the rest of the continent, was very difficult in overcrowded urban areas and townships. And South Africa's healthcare system is one of the most robust on the continent, but even here it's been very difficult to care for all of those affected or process the required volume of tests. In terms of the environmental or the ecological impact, there are just two areas that briefly flag up as of being interesting and important. Firstly, water scarcity. South Africa is highly water scarce. 1 in 3 South Africans lacks access to safe or reliable drinking water, and this obviously is even more significant when one of the main preventative measures for COVID is hand washing, which just isn't isn't available to the same degree for a lot of households. And there's also a highly gendered burden of coping with water shortages and household hygiene. In terms of conservation, there have been one or two isolated good news stories. There was a prominent story about South African rhino poaching, which halved thanks to travel disruption. But more widely, as in every other sector, the impact of the lockdown and the pandemic has been economic contraction, the ability of conservation organisations and protected areas to continuing even to pay salaries or to fulfil their basic functions has been hindered. And estimates by the African Union suggest that the economic impact on Africa's tourism and travel sector may be as much as $50 billion US, so 7 times greater than the 2008 economic crisis, which does raise big questions about the sustainability of travel and tourism-based conservation industry going into the future. So given all of this, as elsewhere, there have been widespread calls to take environmental issues into account in the recovery phase, to build back better, and to increase the urgency of action on climate change, which of course threatens a much more profound disruption of societies and economies. In South Africa, carbon emissions dropped by 250,000 tonnes each day after March the 27th, about 20% lower than normal levels. But despite calls for a green recovery and government rhetoric about green jobs and a just transition to a low carbon economy, so far, as was hinted or shown in Josh's figures from the carbon tracker, the stimulus package has massively favoured fossil fuels over renewables. There's been a $300 million stimulus payment to coal producers. Wind energy was actually curtailed because of lowered electricity demands. The long mooted carbon tax, which has been in discussion almost ever since I've been working on South Africa, was delayed by 3 months. The first payments were due to come in and they were delayed. And the second day after the lockdown, minimum emission standards for sulfur dioxide were dropped. So there's only one. In a lot of the press coverage, there's only one approved measure, increased access to information on industrial pollution, which could really be said to support clean energy. There are other proposed measures, and there's always a lot of rhetoric around a green recovery and a just transition in South Africa. There's been discussions of a 1.5 trillion rand green infrastructure bonds that's being proposed, but we'll have to wait and see on that. Just very briefly, I did a quick look, and there are a few interesting signs elsewhere on the continent as well. Nigeria, as Josh suggested, this graphic is a bit dense, but just to draw out a few factors, there were relief stimulus funds earmarked for renewable energy companies in both Nigeria and in Kenya. As Josh mentioned, Nigeria is ending fossil fuel subsidies, which is a really interesting and, again, has been a very long-running and politically sensitive issue. How long this lasts, I think, really depends on what happens to oil prices. But anyway, it's an interesting one to discuss. In Burkina Faso, the government introduced a 50% reduction in the cost of solar kits for vulnerable households. I think a lot of these at the moment are all quite short-term measures, however, and despite a lot of calls for African leaders to endorse green stimulus, I think there's little sign at the moment of a concerted strategic attempt to use the crisis to leverage a green recovery. I'm going to draw to a conclusion in a second, just a few sort of final comments, perhaps to broaden the discussion and raise a few sort of theoretical comments about some of the biopolitical dimensions of all of this, which have been raised by the South African-based political philosopher Achille Mbembe, and also been some of the themes that I've been exploring in previous research and a book on the Green State in Africa. So one of the lessons, I think, of the last few months in Africa as elsewhere is the centrality of the state in governing life and death. And in Africa, I think this is particularly acute. And this is actually contrary to long-standing assumptions about the fragility or the failure of the state in Africa. African states have very long histories as well as quite intense recent experiences of dealing with pandemics. And as in some respects, as argued in this recent piece in the New Yorker, many African states are even leading the way in terms of infrastructure for screening, contact tracing and surveillance. Just a few brief examples of that. I think the examples themselves are quite revealing. In Rwanda, 5 days after the first cases were confirmed, commercial flights were halted. 2 days later, the entire country was locked down. By the end of April, health workers had tested more than 20,000 people and conducted community surveys. Ethiopia completed a door-to-door survey of Addis Ababa in just 3 weeks, documenting symptoms and travel history for 5 million residents. South Africa sent 30,000 community health workers to survey roughly 15% of its population in less than a month. There's also been a widely discussed $1 test for COVID, which produces results in under 10 minutes, which was developed by the African Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, building on tests that were developed in response to the 2014 Ebola outbreak. Now, I think there are also worrying, concerning aspects of the centrality of state biopolitics in Africa's political ecology, and these include in some places, government attempts to obscure early outbreaks. There's been examples of corrupt use of coronavirus relief funds, and there's also been quite authoritarian responses in some places, and human rights abuses. Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda and South Africa have all made headlines for the role of the police and the army in responding to COVID. Now, this should not be lost on anyone. This is not a particularly or uniquely African problem. I'm sure Elizabeth will might come onto this when she talks about the US, but Achille Mbembe raised this directly, and he said in reference to events in the US, he argued that the key political struggle here is, quote, not one against a specific virus, as against everything that condemns the majority of humankind to a premature cessation of breathing, everything that fundamentally attacks the respiratory tract, everything that, in the long reign of capitalism, has constrained entire segments of the world population, entire races, to a difficult panting breath and life of oppression. So on that cheery note, I'll draw it to a conclusion, but looking forward to the discussion and hearing questions and comments from everyone afterwards. Thank you.
Great. So next is Dr. Benjamin Steuer from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology.
I think you can hear me now. A good morning to all of you here from Hong Kong. My name is Benjamin Steuer. I just want to express a big word of gratitude for Mitya to invite me to this talk, and I admired the presentations before. My talk will deviate slightly, as I'm going to focus on the green stimulus package in China. And as you might read from my title, I see a lot of red flags. So I'm quite pessimistic about it. As for my background, I normally work on the circular economy in China, in Hong Kong, and East Asia, and especially when dealing with China, right? And you want to get to know a bit what is going to happen in China from a, well, political perspective, then there is a certain guideline that I sort of follow through in order to identify sort of new emerging sustainability patterns. And I did the same with a green stimulus package. So what I did in first instance is to look at, well, the annual plenary sessions of the National People's Congress and the 5-year plans. So the upcoming 14th 5-year plan would be, well, we expect it to be there somewhere in November. So from that side, there was absolutely no information. Secondly, what is always a good, well, advice is to look at policy initiatives sort of launched by the central government's key agencies. And we have two major players in this regard. This is on the one hand side, the State Council, the Chief Administrative Authority, and on the other hand side, the National Development and Reform Commission, which is still in charge of managing the economy, providing plans, sort of exercising their economic control on prices and issuing major stimulus plans. From those two agencies, there's nothing came new, no new policies announced, no opinions being set forth. And so I switched thirdly to, well, the level of policy experimentation. Policy experimentation is really a very useful tool and is much discussed in literature, for example, by Sebastian Heimann, and especially in the context of you have a problem at the national level, be that, for example, waste management, you don't know how to tackle it. So your approach is, if you're in the central government, to issue pilot policies at the local level, which are then used to either, you gain these experiences from different regions, and then you formulate a national law or national regulation, or you refine your existing laws and regulation. So that is actually a lot going on in the domain of the green economy in regards to pilot projects. But again, here, since 2020 and since the start of COVID, there was nothing happened. In fourth instance, and this is rather new for those who are interested in engaging themselves with China, with environmental governance, is Xi Jinping's environmental governance, also termed as authoritarian environmentalism in China. So what Xi Jinping essentially did in order to regain much of the decision-making power is that he established central commissions and leading small groups for all the major domains of society, of politics, of military, diplomacy, and of course of everything related to the environment. And Xi Jinping is always at its core, so he tries to exercise his power directly. This measure, or these measures, were taken to re-centralize the decision-making authority. So if you think about Deng Xiaoping, who initiated the reforms in China in the late 70s and which introduced a gradual decentralization in decision-making, so Xi Jinping is practically going back to the path of Mao Zedong. Unfortunately, I have to inform you that my desktop research and also my contacts on mainland told me, well, there's really nothing going on in terms of a green recovery, of a green stimulus package. Why do these pessimistic analyses dominate? Well, essentially, you find really statements from the top brass in China's decision-making hierarchy. The Ministry of Environment and Ecology, for example, states that there's no doubt that with that recovery going on in China, that environmental protection is going to suffer a lot. Furthermore, we see that we find again the pure evidence that China's economy is highly energy intensive, and there is sort of a step towards increasing or subsidizing high carbon sectors, which is driving the recovery process, and by implications also emissions rise a lot. So what you see here are two major, trends that I could find via secondary literature, which is on the one hand side that restrictions on industrial pollution and coal use were loosened, and this was actually enforced by Xi Jinping during the last 2 years. So he put a lot of pressure behind that, and given that this is loosened now, or that is relaxed control, I would say I would remain rather pessimistic. Additionally, we also see that carbon emissions have grown in line with economic recovery, and they were indeed higher than the same month last year. So if we look at two graphics, you see this quite clearly. This is a comparison of CO2 emissions between 2019 and 2020. And you see that in May of 2020, the overall emissions have already surpassed 2019 levels, albeit that China's economy had such a massive contraction and that growth is decisively lower. Another point, or from an opposite perspective, if we look at how much the sustainable or renewable energy sources are sort of supported in China at the moment, for wind energy and photovoltaics, it looks rather dire. So we see here, this is for each year, the first quarter of the year, we see here that in terms of installed capacity, 2020 is far below what has been achieved in 2019. The question is, what is the source of panic, right? Going back to fossil fuels, to high energy use, I would say political stability. At the same time, I would also conclude that political stability on the long term is not possible without sustainability. What I mean by that is I refer to what is considered in Chinese studies as the traditional stability paradigm for politics. So after 1980, the idea was that the Chinese Communist Party bases its legitimacy on its capacity to harness, to yield economic growth. As a consequence, economic growth and in turn generated jobs and income opportunities contribute to social stability. People suddenly get jobs who have been poor before, so I'm referring to this transition period in the late 80s. They're happy, right? They can start to consume, and thereby their trust into the Chinese Communist Party increases. And this sort of system has worked really nicely up until, I would say, around 2014, with economic growth decreasing gradually. And I would say that due to ecological disruption, this traditional paradigm is severely affected. So if we think about the presence, and China is again, or the Communist Party is again trying to, start the growth engine, they will face a very severe problem that they've been facing, I would say, the last 15 years. There is this issue of environmental deterioration and resource shortages, which, well, of course, impair the capacity of the country to generate economic growth. The reason is rather simple, right? If you lack the inputs, or if your air is too dirty to breathe and workers cannot attend to facilities, of course, there is an impact on economic growth. This, by implication, also impairs the capacity of economic growth to, contribute to social stability. Furthermore, the environmental degradation and the excessive use of resources has directly affected social stability. So there are no official numbers in China on protests, but we know from, field research, we know from communications that there are a lot of protests going on in China, and an increasing number is actually centered on the topic of environmental, sustainability, on environmental soundness. So by implication, if society is not doing well, this sort of, harms the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And in order to conclude that, the worse the environment gets, right, the worse it affects economic growth, the more it affects social stability, the more environmental deterioration and excessive resource use will have an impact on the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. Having said that, I want to finish my rather short talk, and I'm open and looking forward to your questions.
Brilliant, thanks. So a couple of relatively pessimistic talks. So the next one is on the US, so that should cheer us up in terms of environmental politics. So our final talk is from Professor Elizabeth Bomberg from the University of Edinburgh.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. And I'm glad that we can now cheer you all up with a discussion of the US. Can I just check that the slides are visible? Just nodding, that's great. Okay. Huge thanks to the PSA and Mitya for the invitation and allowing me to come and speak about the US, or the American story. And one of the questions that we want to ask is the extent to which has the US embraced this opportunity, seized this opportunity to transition to a green recovery, accelerating a change to a low carbon, or even more ambitiously embracing a notion of well-being and rethinking the way we live and work and measure progress. So I will make 3 points on this, and the first is The answer to that, if we look at the federal or national level, is absolutely not. The Trump administration, the federal level, has not embraced this opportunity for a green recovery. And we know that since Trump entered office, he has sought to dismantle and weaken scores of environmental rules and regulations. And we've seen a significant uptick in this trend since March, when the federal government began to actually use the pandemic as a reason to further and sometimes drastically relax rules for polluters and to encourage more fossil fuel extraction. Indeed, COVID explicitly was used as a grounds to open up more wilderness areas for drilling, to cancel fines and suspend monitoring of, say, petrochemical companies or other major polluters. And according to officials in the Environmental Protection Agency, and that is the federal agency whose core responsibility is to protect the environment, but officials, this is Andrew Wheeler pictured here, the director of the EPA, and he stated explicitly that such a suspension was needed to ensure immediate action to get our economy going again by cutting some of this cumbersome red tape. And the reason in part that the executive, the Trump administration, has been able to move along these lines is that it hasn't received the check or the pushback from the US Congress, certainly not in the Senate, which is controlled right now by the Republicans. And more generally, I think we can see that there's been a lack of green recovery enthusiasm amongst the Congress as a whole. And we can see this in the major recovery bill called the CARES Act. And again, the stimulus bill, and Josh was suggesting this at the beginning, here's the opportunity to support investment in renewables and green infrastructure. In this case, this fund was not used to, say, bail out renewable energy firms or their workers. It did, however, allow bailouts for airlines and for fossil fuel companies. An example here is that the bill set aside $25 billion US for US airlines with virtually no environmental or climate conditionality attached. And the Republicans, led by Mitch McConnell, he's the Republican Senate Majority Leader, and he argued that some climate-friendly, or what he called climate-crazy policies, suggested by others, would, quote, kill jobs and crush an already ailing economy, though there wasn't much evidence, any evidence to support those claims. And there's now a second stimulus bill. It's stalled in Congress just now, but it also does not include any big plans for any green stimulus. And in the meantime, you do have the Democrats in both houses who have presented climate action plans, and these could be quite significant if the Democrats are able to gain control of one or both houses after the election. However, I want to move below the federal government response and look at other responses elsewhere below the federal level. And here we do see some really interesting ideas and initiatives and actions and movements. We need to look at what the states, individual states are doing, not just at what the federal governments are doing. And several states have stepped up to take action that could help, say, position renewable energy for a rapid recovery. In Midwest states, including, red states and Midwest states, business leaders are working with state level officials to help displace renewable energy employees. There's a huge solar jobs program being launched in Massachusetts. Governors in California, in Washington, and Oregon are making quite explicit the clear link between these devastating fires that they're experiencing right now and climate change, and the need to address both in any state and federal level recovery plans. Another really important response, and really interesting one, and touched upon by Carl in his presentation, is what's going on at the grassroots level in response to COVID and much else besides. And what we've seen here is spurred on by the Black Lives Matter movement, a growing awareness and communication of the link between COVID, between race, between environmental degradation. And we know that low-income communities, communities of color, are disproportionately impacted by pollution, and they're at higher risk of death from coronavirus. And they are certainly most likely to be located very close to major sources of pollution, including refineries, power plants, highways, landfills, etc. So what we've seen is calls for a just recovery, bringing together these different groups on environmental protection, on climate action, and justice. And this matters an awful lot because traditionally the environmental movement in the US has been slow to take up issues of environmental racism. So this is a response that I think is really worth looking at. The third point I want to make is about the election itself in November, and the election will indeed matter, and the outcome and the prognosis for a green recovery will depend on the election outcome at several different levels. Even Trump has now realized the importance of climate and environment to the election in certain states. And that might explain his announcement earlier this week in Florida that actually, you might not have known this, but he is the #1 environmental president. No one has been more environmentally #1 since Teddy Roosevelt, he stated. So even while, say, opening up wilderness areas to drilling in Alaska, which was announced this month, he had performed an about-face in the area of moratoriums of offshore drilling in certain states, in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. And this is interesting because he had previously supported lifting moratoriums in several of those states. But this matters because these are Republican-led states where Republicans are in congressional races are threatened, where there's huge opposition amongst the public to offshore drilling, and where Trump needs to win the Electoral College votes from those states. So this, so we've seen action from Trump, bizarre action, but we're not surprised by that anymore. We've seen action by Trump. What about Biden? Biden is not a radical climate activist, but he does recognize the links between climate change and recovery. In summer, he said explicitly, climate change is not only an existential threat to humanity, but could be the very answer to get us out of this economic situation we're in. So his climate plan proposes trillions to be spent boosting clean energy in the transportation sector, power and building sectors, and this is part of his ambitious economic recovery plan. Moreover, I would suggest that he sees climate and environmental recovery as an area where he can build a bridge with progressives and left of the Democratic Party. And we see this, he's compiled a task force which includes representatives of some of these constituencies. And also his choice of vice presidential running mate, Kamala Harris, is also key to making this link between climate justice and recovery. And while Kamala Harris, is relatively new to climate advocacy, she really hit the ground running last year during her own attempt to be chosen as the Democratic nominee for president. She endorsed early on the US Green Deal, and that combines decarbonization with guarantees on job and health. She was one of the original co-sponsors. And in July, she partnered with Congressional Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a Climate Equity Act, and this would require federal agencies to consider environmental justice more fully in their policymaking and recovery plans. So my point here is that the presidential election is very important to any future discussion in this area, but congressional elections will matter also hugely. And any future green stimulus is going to be far more likely if the Democrats can take control of both houses. And I'd go so far as to say that that is not just it's a necessary, though not sufficient, condition. So we've got lots to play for and lots to watch out for in the election in November, but also beyond. Okay, thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks for all those. Thanks for all those talks. We've got plenty of questions that I've noted down to go through. I think if people still want to submit questions, we probably should have time to get to them. So anyone watching who wants to submit a question, we should still have time if you want to submit additional ones. Just doing that in the chat box, and I'll note it down. Before I go through some of the questions that we've had submitted, I just wonder if any of the panelists wanted to kind of directly respond to anything that they've heard from the other panelists, either a question or a comment on anything they've heard, particularly earlier speakers. Okay, so firstly, a couple of questions that we've had that sort of for specific speakers. So this was directed at Carl, but I think probably Elizabeth will want to respond as well. But this was basically referring to sort of South Africa and asking asking you to comment basically on the role of populism in this area. So obviously, sort of obviously, I think there's probably been quite a lot of discussion about populism and COVID generally, but I guess populism, COVID, and particularly populism, COVID, green recovery, and whatever context you're able to refer to.
Well, thanks, Mitya, and yeah, thanks for the question as well. I think it's a really interesting topic, and I'm sure many of the panelists and people in attendance have also got things to say about this as well. Just maybe to say something very briefly about three different countries in terms of the response. I mean, South Africa is an interesting one in terms of the dimension of populist politics. At times, the ANC very strongly plays to a kind of grassroots populist agenda. At other times, I think, and particularly maybe in the area of a green recovery, it has. I wouldn't particularly characterize it as a populist response. It's very much framed around sustainable development, green economy, green growth, environmental justice. It is definitely a modernization project. It's invoking the language of ecological modernization or environmental modernization, as well as environmental justice. And what I think is really interesting is the fusion and the tensions between notions of modernization and populist politics and populist green politics. What struck me even before the coronavirus crisis elsewhere on the continent is exactly that potential for green growth agendas or green recovery now agendas to be fused or articulated in terms of quite authoritarian populist politics. And the two countries that leap to mind for me are Rwanda and Ethiopia, both of which have in the last 5 to 10 years have promoted some of the most high profile green stimulus, green jobs, green transformation agendas as part of an explicitly nationalist modernization drive to become middle-income countries. Both of these countries can do this have the capacity to do this because they're both quite authoritarian regimes, and they can fuse this agenda with a populist nationalist modernization agenda. The ability of the South African government to do that is much less clear, and South Africa, and as someone like Patrick Bond would say, South Africa talks left and walks right, but sometimes it doesn't even walk very far at all when it comes to environmental issues and agendas.
Right. Did you, Elizabeth, would you want to come in on populism at all?
Yes, sure. I think what we see in the US is the Trump administration quite explicitly using tools of populist scaremongering to distract from the COVID and the links that COVID has with some of these other issues of justice, and taking a page from populist authoritarian leaders elsewhere, focusing on fear, focusing on the threat to law and order. So just to me, a classic tool from authoritarian populist leaders everywhere. On the other side, if we look at populism, not the right-wing variety, but more of the left-wing protest, then we see a much greater attempt to explicitly link these issues of COVID and the environment and the recovery. So you see from Trump an attempt to decouple these, to treat them separately and to ignore what we can. And then from the left, a more explicit attempt to link them together.
Great. So we've had a question for you, Josh. A couple of quite specific points about the tracker. So first one was a question whether you compared the findings and your work with the energy policy tracker and the 2020 platform for design. So whether you compared it with those. And secondly, about as far as they could see, some countries were excluded, such as Sweden and Norway, and irrespective. And also, if you did exclude some countries, how did you decide to exclude them?
Hi, yeah, first I just wanted to apologise for the mic noise before. This is the perils of trying to work in a home office with other people, I'm afraid. And my mic was jostling against my shirt. So in answer to the questions, yes, we did compare. We made use of the energy policy tracker, particularly. This is as the question acknowledged. We're not the first people to. There were other attempts at the same time to try and track the green recovery, and one of them is the energy policy tracker, which has been very helpful. We've talked there a bit. The platform for redesign, I don't think I've come across that one, but I will definitely take a look at it. And yeah, as I mentioned in my talk, there are some similarities and differences between the different trackers that have been put together, and that reflects somewhat the kind of difficulty in defining what is and what isn't green stimulus or part of a green recovery. And in terms of the countries we chose, so we started out looking at the largest economies, essentially. So we made sure that we had the EU, Germany. We tried to incorporate what we could from China and India, UK, France. We haven't done anything on the US, I guess, because of what Elizabeth referred to with the kind of lack of federal green recovery measures. But then beyond that, as you can see from the tracker, we have got some much smaller countries in there, places like Ireland and Finland, and we've been doing that more on a kind of ad hoc basis. So when there's like a big announcement, we'll try and put it in. But in terms of we haven't intentionally excluded countries like Sweden and Norway, and we probably will in time incorporate them. And it's much more that there's not necessarily rhyme or reason behind the exclusion of sort of smaller economies. But if anyone feels watching this that we have missed out quite a substantial package from a specific country, then I would encourage you to get in contact with us. You can find the contact details on the Green Recovery Tracker quite high up. So do drop us an email and let us know.
Great, thank you. So question there, we had a question for Benjamin specifically. So this was a little more theoretical and raised the idea that Confucianism is often sort of brought in discussions about environmental politics in China, and whether that has manifested itself in any way in debate about COVID and environmental politics.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ashley, for the question. I mean, Confucianism is especially under Chinese Communist Party, it's a very sensitive issue, because they reinvigorated it as a means to sort of trace back the roots of why people in China should be obedient to those who lead the country. So it's instrumentalized, right? I would say, however, if you go away from Beijing, if you go away from the big cities, you go to localities and speak with people, you realize that, especially in southwestern provinces, right, where a lot of people still live in very close interaction with the environment, they would rather refer to Taoist principles, they would rather refer maybe to Buddhist principles, who have elements of having integrated nature into their teachings, right? I mean, Taoism has its own philosophy, it's a natural there's a natural branch, a natural philosophy branch in Taoism itself. So, I mean, Confucianism, and this is one more thing, in recent years, the government has sort of realized that too many people were too interested in Confucianism. And this is, of course, then becoming a fight of ideologies. So, right, parts are simply cancelled out. And I would say in the recent recovery, I have not seen it. I have not seen it. I was quite curious when reading your question, that there is a lot of talk about Confucianism when it comes to that. I mean, with the background in Chinese studies and you know, having first approached circular economy from the perspective of Chinese studies, of course, you sooner or later get into contact with you know, philosophies and people tracing what is happening now back to philosophies. And I would never have seen Confucianism. So as for my knowledge, I would not have seen this in the current COVID response. What I see rather is that when it comes to COVID, every measure from the central government is great, and rather the measures from local governments are not so good, which is a very effective tool of blaming local governments, and local government leaders can very easily be exchanged, and trying to keep as much as authority and legitimacy with the Central Communist Party or with the central leadership. So, I mean, this is sort of what I observe and read and hear. Thanks a lot, though.
So I've got one more a specific question for a specific panelist, and then a few more general ones. So we just had a question for Elizabeth about the Republican Party more widely than Trump, and the environment, and whether I guess the kind of stereotypical image is still there, or if there's, you know, for example, if Trump lost the election after that, if there's some potential there for shifting attitudes or sort of analysis of where that party is at with the.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and one that I ponder myself quite a lot. What's been striking about the Republican Party during the Trump administration is the extent to which the Republican Party has played, in my view, a submissive role and has not challenged the president in a way that other parties in the past would push back in their own, even against their own president when that was warranted. So if Trump does lose the, if he does lose the election, the question is whether the Republicans will continue to carry on the position that they've taken under Trump, or whether they will be more open to a slightly wider view of progress and recovery and things. And my own inkling is that they would broaden their view, that they would be more open to some of the ideas coming out of the democratic plans, especially those that are focused on helping the renewable energy industry and the jobs that come with that. You have to remember that Midwest states, Republican states, have some of the highest levels of enthusiasm and public support for low carbon energy. So when they're freed from the boot of a Trump as president, it could be that some of these ideas are able to push through, but that might be wishful thinking on my part as well.
So we had a question which I think was specifically for Benjamin, but I'm going to try and broaden it out a bit and ask everyone about this. And this is sort of specifically about the idea of a Green New Deal, because sort of I'm partly bringing a British perspective to this, but I think in some countries in the last sort of couple of years, there's been a sort of developing move towards and sort of momentum behind the idea of a Green New Deal, even if that hasn't manifested itself in parties in government. There's been major parties out of government that have taken it on, and in some countries it has had an impact in terms of government policies. Then you kind of get the COVID crisis, and clearly I think one of the themes of the discussion today has been that it can go either way. It can kind of go down and we need to subsidise fossil fuels, aeroplane industry, etc., or that it's added momentum in some countries to this idea of needing to invest. Why don't we invest in renewables, etc. So I'd be interested in reflections from either generally or in relation to the kind of specific countries that you're talking about on the Green New Deal and the sort of why not? We've seen the kind of momentum building or not at all. To that's been quite clear in some of the talks today. Is, why is that sort of there or not there in the country you're talking about, and more generally a sort of reflection on the politics around the Green New Deal in light of COVID.
Do you want me to? I mean, I've just spoken. I'm happy to let anyone else.
No, I think you start and then
the floor. But I'll say I could say a couple things about the Green New Deal in the U.S., which is when I mentioned that the Democrats, both in the House and the Senate, they've come up with their own climate action plans, and the one in the House, and the Democrats have a majority in the House, is closer to the Green New Deal, although there is very little mention of that, and that's because in the U.S. the Green New Deal has become, like so much else, a very partisan issue, and just mentioning the Green New Deal makes it more difficult right now for Republicans to embrace those ideas. But I think as a counter, maybe the others can say something about this. the European Union's Green Deal is, and Josh referred to this in his tables as well. This is a really ambitious example of precisely how you can respond to a crisis and stimulate economies in a much more holistic way. And we know this still has many hurdles to go through and has to be implemented. But I think the contrast there, just in terms of the embrace of the language and the tenets of the idea of a Green Deal in Europe, or the Green New Deal, is really fascinating. I don't know how it works in some of the other countries that you guys have looked at.
Well, I can say something briefly about South Africa and maybe connect it to some of these broader discussions in Europe and elsewhere as well. I think for me, the ideas, although it's not always branded as a Green New Deal, but green jobs and green growth have been quite a prominent element of government of ANC rhetoric in South Africa for a long time, and South Africa has always liked to position itself as a global leader on climate change and environmental justice and these sorts of things as well, although the reality of that is often quite different. My sense for the last 6 months is that this current crisis has reinforced the belief of those people who think that something like a green recovery or a Green New Deal is necessary. I'm not sure it's convinced many people who weren't persuaded beforehand, and so the question for me is whether the political situation we're in opens up space or increases political momentum or decreases it. I think in some places it probably has shifted entrenched political coalitions and makes more movement possible. My sense from South Africa is that, and I think this seems to me a broader feature as well, is that a lot of governments seem to be still in almost day by day or week by week response mode. No one really knows what's happening in 2 weeks' time. Maybe I'm thinking about courses restarting in Manchester, and no one knows what's happening next week or the week after, let alone planning economic transformations on a longer term horizon. And in South Africa at the moment, the ANC is still trying to deal with corruption allegations and allegations that have been very large abuses of public money in terms of some of the stimulus packages and how PPE is being bought. These are, again, not uniquely African problems. There are many other countries, including the UK, which has also had similar sorts of debates about this. And in South Africa, in terms of the capacity of state institutions like healthcare and so on to deliver some of the overall strategies. So I tend to be, I think I'm a little bit pessimistic that this crisis has in any sense helped at all in terms of creating the political coalitions for the Green New Deal, but there's obviously still a lot to play for, and everything is in flux at the moment.
Just quickly, we also had a question drawing a bit of a comparison between the EU's response and the African Union. Is there anything to add on that in terms of potential for something equivalent of a green response?
Yeah, I mean the African Union and other kind of influential continental bodies like the African Development Bank and the UN Economic Commission for Africa, they've all come out with pronouncements about the need to prioritize green stimulus and the need for energy transitions. The current crisis, all of them say is an opportunity for governments to prioritize leapfrogging and building back better and all of these things. I mean, the issue with a lot of this is they do say this every time there's any sort of political crisis, and the cynical view of the African Union is that is I mean, its main message often seems to be, we need increased levels of international aid, we need development finance, we need technology transfer. I'm not saying that those things aren't correct. They're just, sometimes the rhetoric of the African Union is, yes, these things are all necessary. Please give us international aid in order to help us do this. Whereas actually, when you look at countries that have significant kind of green growth strategies like Ethiopia and Rwanda, they're not doing this on the back of development aid. They're doing this on the back of their own modernization and industrialization strategies, or funds from elsewhere, notably China.
Can I just ping in there as well, Mitya, if you don't mind, because I'm really struck by the question and that answer, because the huge, I mean, one, you could say the huge difference between the EU, the European Union, and the African Union. This is the EU has trillions of dollars that it could spend on this, and it would provide hundreds of billions of dollars directed towards those initiatives, and the African Union does not have that. And it's so interesting what you say is that, so they've connected that to calls for aid, quite, which in development help, which makes sense. But we also have seen both in the UK and elsewhere how precisely the funds that might otherwise have gone, the proportion of the budgets that might go for development aid, we see these being cut, and governments are using the pandemic as an excuse for doing that. So that gap is likely, unfortunately, to get wider, not smaller.
Great, thanks. And Benjamin and Josh, did you have anything to add on sort of Green New Deal, politics around that in any sort of international context?
Yes, of course. If I can go first, just very basically, I would say the momentum is a bit gone, because for China between 2000 to 2018, when the economy was really growing extremely fast, and there were the financial means to start launching some initiatives like circular economy, like sustainable development, something like low carbon economy. This really came on a 2-3 year basis. Every 2-3 years, a new initiative, and there was a lot of money poured into that, or a lot of industries are subsidized. I mean, I saw when Josh presented this table that maybe the two good indicators that are more beneficial for the environment on the China side was that they pushed forward with this electric vehicle. I think was a tax relief or something, right? Deduction in taxes. So this is something that actually originated in this period from 2000 to 2018 broadly, and in the last years, like the big hype was an ecological civilization. Now, the question is always, do you believe in this kind of political slogans, or do you think this is just a hoax? Well, it sort of manifests, at least in policy experimentation, where you have at least some companies involved and they try something new. So there's some response. Now with COVID, I mean, crashing the whole thing is like a caesura, right? Stops everything, and China seems to be, at least within these first 8 months, to be back on track with this resource intensive and rather low resource productive growth. For me, when looking forward for a new green deal from China, I would say I'm very, very hopeful really for these for the 14th 5-year plan. Why do I refer to those 5-year plans? Really, there is some, for a lot of people say, like, come on, those 5-year plans, that's outdated. Why do you still use that? In China, there's a lot of ritualism and symbolism in policymaking. And those plans do give you, if you, for example, compare one plan with the preceding one, then you realize, okay, which domain has increased in terms of volume of paragraphs being spent in it. And that means something. It's not just, I mean, if you read through that in Chinese, it's very tough because everything seems like a perfect paradise. But the thing is that should the Chinese government proceed by continuing to strengthen and underscore environmental protection and green growth, this would be could initiate something like some well, I would say a stronger financial stimulus. Last word on that is that if we compare the current crisis in China, the COVID crisis, with the response to the financial crisis in 2008, then generally speaking, there is this assessment that there is less money available in China. The local debts are higher, right? So local governments are highly indebted, and that also private households, be that residential or company-wise, that they have amassed a lot of debt. So there is less financial leeway to really engage with a big plan, with a big stimulus package. So this sort of a bit darkens the horizon.
Great. So, Josh, shall I give any final comment to you on either Green New Deal or more broadly?
I don't have tons to add to that. Just that something I noticed in our analysis, for example, the concept of a Green New Deal has been kind of repurposed a bit certainly in South Korea. The government ran on a platform of a kind of Green New Deal, and that's now that was only a couple of months or a few months ago when they got into power, when the elections were held, and it's kind of been repurposed somewhat around the idea of green recovery. So that's quite interesting, and kind of similar thing in Ireland maybe to some extent. They've just formed a new government, and that includes the Irish Green Party, and they also have pushed an idea of a Green New Deal, which is kind of now wrapped up in the idea of green recovery. But yeah, no, that's all I have to say on that, really.
Great, thank you. So not going to get to, there's a couple of questions we're not going to get to, I'm afraid, but to finish on time, all I'll do is say thank you to the panelists for really interesting and wide-ranging discussion. It's so great to have so many different sort of international perspectives covered in one session, and thank you to the PSA for supporting this session, making it possible with the organisation.
And thanks all of you, including the audience. Great questions.
Yeah, and thanks, Mitya, for chairing us all.
Yes.
Keeping us right.
Thanks a lot.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.